Good morning all, and thanks again for tuning in to this fourth annual Young China Watchers Lau China Institute Conference. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Cindy Yu. Cindy is the China reporter for The Spectator, the oldest weekly magazine in the world, and is also the host of the Chinese Whispers podcast, where she interviews experts on key issues across Chinese politics, society, and culture. We are honoured to have you here today, Cindy, and very much look forward to hearing your thoughts on whether the 2020s will really be China's decade. I'd like to now hand over to you, Cindy, to kick us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Cameron, and thanks to everyone who put effort into this conference for inviting me. I'm incredibly honoured, and I also feel a little bit underqualified because when it came to that poll, I voted unsure to the last question of whether or not 2020 is going to be China's decade. So I'll just run you through my thoughts about why I'm unsure, but it's good to see so many of you having more definite opinions on it than I do. Part of my difficulty with predicting where modern China goes next is looking back over recent decades and seeing the change that China has gone through already. I find China an incredibly difficult beast to predict because it's just changed so radically. You know, in the 70s, we had the Cultural Revolution fervor, which ended with Mao's death, and then reform and opening. Reform and opening continued. We had the return of Hong Kong and the accession to the WTO in 2001, which seemed to be a completely different China, more open economically and politically China than it is since the last in the last decade or so under President Xi. So all that has happened in the mere 50 years or so. I don't know what China is going to be like in the next 10 years, because 5 years ago, we didn't think that President Xi would be abolishing term limits. Everything is up for grabs, I think. But there is good reason to think that the 2020s will be China's decade. For one, I want to talk about technology. China is no longer the factory of the world, and we see that through its industrial policy of Made in China 2025, whereas trying to shift away from that supply chain of just manufacturing the low values added section of the chain. And in the West, a lot of people say, you know, people are moving away from China and towards Southeast Asian countries, and that's a good thing because we're relying less on China. But actually, that is exactly what China does want. It wants to move up that values chain. It wants Vietnam and Malaysia to take up more of that low values added part of things. And Made in China 2025, as you all know, is a very ambitious industrial strategy to get China to have supremacy in a lot of high-tech sectors, from semiconductors to biotech to environmental technology and everything else. In terms of demographics as well, I want to talk about China's booming middle class. You know, it's predicted to be 520 million people by the middle of this decade. That will be the biggest middle class in the world. It's also going to be richer than ever before. By that same period of time, China's GDP per capita will be at $14,000 per person. This sector of people are also incredibly cosmopolitan. They're well educated. Every single year, as you all know, 700,000 Chinese people go abroad to study, and so they are bringing back that knowledge, and they're absorbing so much about the outside world. And they're also people who are more confident in themselves and in their culture. As Cameron, as you mentioned, I run this Chinese Whispers podcast, and for one of my episodes, I looked at the Chinese obsession with luxury goods, Gucci and Dolce and Gabbana, and all this sort of stuff. But actually, what was interesting was that the expert that I spoke to for that podcast told me that actually, when it came to millennials and Generation Z, these young people are becoming ever more confident in the Chinese brands that they come across. They don't have to be following Western brands in order to be seen as chic. This idea of 崇洋媚外, that what is Western is good, is no longer necessarily the case for younger populations. When we look at the economy as well, there are predictions from both sides, Western and in China, that the Chinese economy is going to exceed the Americans by by the end of this decade. And just take a look at COVID. The American economy is going to go back to its pre-COVID levels by the middle of next year, whereas the Chinese economy in Q3 has already reported a 5% growth rate. So it's incredible what the economy is doing, and especially comparatively in this post-COVID or during COVID era, intra-COVID era, that it's able to bounce back in such a way. When it comes to politics and the state system, yes, the coronavirus has been a challenge, but it's far from the Chernobyl moment that so many commentators thought it would be at the beginning of this year. Apart from the initial cover up, and obviously you can debate whether or not draconian measures are the right way forward, China has clamped down on coronavirus within its borders. And it was able to unleash its people from lockdown from about April onwards, saving the economy and hundreds of thousands of lives. Now, I'm not saying that the reaction has been perfect, and far from it. And the draconian measures, as I said, you can argue with them on liberty grounds, but it's clear that the quarantine measures have been effective. The flight ban, the border control has been effective. And that just shows that the state apparatus is working much better than from where I'm sitting in London, I'm seeing the Westminster government is capable of doing. China is also able to centralize its foreign policy and its domestic policy in the way that the West can only dream of. This week, for example, Australian exporters are being told by their Chinese counterparts in China that their beef and their wine may not be exported to China in future because of wider geopolitical tensions. So that's private importers being nudged by the government to say, don't use Australian anymore. And if in doubt of China's rise, you can just look at the West's reaction. Often, when it's a case by case basis, we hear about national security or human rights, but underlying all of that is this geopolitical tussle. It's the West understanding finally that China is here to take its place. When we talk about the US, for example, it was interesting in that poll that Donald Trump, or Biden indeed, was the overwhelming outside actor that would have been impacted China's position in the next decade. And I think that's right. And we've seen that whether it's through a trade war or Huawei becoming concerned, starting from the US, but now spreading out towards other Five Eyes nations. And from where I'm sitting in the UK as well, Westminster politics is becoming ever more hawkish on China. It's hard to think that just 10 years ago, David Cameron was having a pint with President Xi, heralding a new golden era. We're far from that stage now, and I don't think we will be going back to that stage. One academic that I was speaking to was asking me, why has the Conservative Party in the UK gone so 360 on China? 180, I should say. And the reason for that is because you've got these bright, up and coming Conservative politicians who see China as the next fashionable cause to be allying themselves with, in the same way that Brexit was before Brexit happened, in that Euroscepticism was where the party was leaning towards, but not quite there yet. So if you can drag the government along, it makes you seem like a pioneer. And that's, I think, explains the rise of groups like the China Research Group within the Conservative Party, led by the Foreign Affairs Select Committee Chairman Tom Tugendhat. But I think this also shows that the serious challenge to Chinese supremacy in the 2020s, as I mentioned, this growing international opposition will make it very difficult for China to, enact the ideal plan for itself in the coming decade. Huawei is being lopped off in either side, and China's semiconductor capability at home is just not enough yet to provide for its chip needs. And that brings me on towards the suspicion in the West of all things Chinese these days. Huawei, I can understand as a telecoms company, it is within some crucial areas. But we've seen that in recent years spread to suspicion of Chinese scientists, Chinese students, Chinese investment even in non-core areas, and Chinese companies like TikTok, for which I'm yet to see convincing national security argument about. And that's not helped by belligerence from the Chinese government at home and abroad. When I talk about belligerence, another word for it is assertiveness, I guess. But as you will all know, since President Xi has taken the reins, Chinese foreign policy has become much more assertive in creating a Chinese equivalent of the Monroe Doctrine, as it were, establishing its near abroad, whether it's in the west with India, in the south and east China Seas, or indeed a more assertive tone when it comes to Taiwan. At home, human rights abuses have continued and got worse with its treatment of the Uyghurs, and all of that is contributing towards a much more hawkish West. China also has its internal problems. The debt crisis, triggered by the financial crisis of 2008, have been made worse by coronavirus. Debt is now at 3 times the amount of GDP. China's tighter politics is having impact. And what I was going to say, use as an example on this point, is Made in China 2025. As I mentioned, the semiconductor capability is just not there yet. The target from that industrial strategy top down is that by 2020, 40% of China's semiconductor needs will be served domestically. At the moment, that's about 17%. So it's just not happening. But what is the even better example for that point of tighter politics having an impact on China's rise is what's happened this week with Ant Financial. An incredible IPO offering from Alibaba to take itself onto the market. A $37 billion offering was stopped in the last minute from the very top of the Chinese Communist Party with last minute regulatory changes. Now it's unclear if Alibaba will be able to go on the market in the next 6 months, or indeed if ever, if depending on how crippling these regulations are. But had that gone over, that would have been an organic national champion, this term that we hear so much about when it comes to Huawei. But Alibaba would have been an absolutely organic one, cutting edge technological champion. Yet politics came first. So I guess the question is, in the next decade, will China bite off too much? Is its aggression in its foreign policy, for example, in words and actions, a sign of insecurity? Are these issues festering under the surface in the same way that they festered under the surface of the USSR in the days before the fall of the Berlin Wall? We don't know that yet because, as I mentioned at the beginning, modern China is just so unprecedented. I won't have mentioned everything here that you will be thinking about, and as China watchers, I hope you'll be sympathetic with that because you know just how vast this country is and how vast this topic is. I just want to finish on one final note, which is just that with all of this, I think the West and China still understand each other too little. In the West, people still, and politicians and the public still too often see the Chinese and China as a monolith, that it's hard to distinguish between them. And we see that in the discussion around Chinese students in the UK, for example, where just their mere presence is seen as state presence on campuses. Well, you need to separate the government and its people. And when it comes to Western ideas of China as well, I think social credit scheme and the reporting surrounding that is an incredibly good example of how badly people in the West understand China. You know, this Black Mirror equivalent that was reported on so much last year and the year before, because 2020 was the target that the state set for its rollout. Well, it's November 2020 now, and it just hasn't happened in that all-encompassing way at all. Yet the West and a lot of, you know, politicians and the public alike think that it is just like Black Mirror, and that all of that comes from a lack of political will to understand China and a lack of belief that you need to understand China more, as if it was just a black box. I think part of the problem is that so few Westerners speak Chinese and go to China and actually talk to normal Chinese people. So that's why I'm so honored to be invited on to give the keynote speech in this conference, because it's filled virtually by bright young China watchers who are the next generation of the West's interaction with China. And whether or not you end up in a more hawkish position or not, at least you're doing that from a position of knowledge and understanding and enthusiasm for China. So coming back to the exam question, the short answer is I'm not sure if 2020 is going to be China's decade, but I just hope that it's not the decade of a second Cold War. And to do that, we need to increase understanding from both sides. So with that, Cameron, I'll hand it back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Cindy, for your thoughts and perspective on all of those issues. I think it was a really insightful analysis of so many of the different themes that we approach when it comes to China, and such a great way to start this conference, because I think we're going to delve into some of those aspects in a little bit more detail with our upcoming panels. So before I open the floor to anyone who has questions directly for you, I think I'd like to start with some of my own questions. And you've mentioned so many things, one of them as well being the US election. I was wondering, you know, we're all still reeling from that emotional roller coaster, but do you think the outcome, let's say it's going to be a Biden presidency, do you see this affecting China's behavior either domestically or internationally? Are we going to see some profound shifts?
It's a great question, and obviously it's the big question right now. When it comes to whether or not China will change its behavior, I think China will certainly try to enact what Republicans have accused Biden of being, i.e., Beijing Biden. And I think China will try to use trade as a way of buttering Biden up, because Trump, let's remember, is an incredibly exceptional politician. He heralded this new era of hawkishness on China in a way that Republican politicians hadn't really done before. So now that we're going back to the Democrats, is it going to be back as business as usual? I think Chinese government will be asking themselves that question. And what's particularly interesting is that I've got family friends who work in state media in China who say that actually they're getting a lot of instructions to not go in too hard on the American election. They don't want to be seen as swaying it either for Biden or for Trump, because then they could be used by the other side. So China is taking a back seat at the moment, seeing what a Biden presidency could bring. And I think China will definitely try to use investment in the way that it has done in the last 10 years. You know, after the financial crisis, China kind of had to step to the fore because it had easy money in a way that a lot of places in the West didn't. So I think it will definitely try. But on the Biden side, I don't know if Biden will necessarily bite. I think much of it depends on how he wins this election. It looks like the Republicans have taken the Senate and the Democrats have a diminished lead in the House of Representatives. So with the Republican force still pretty strong in government, I'm not sure Biden will want to be seen as too pro-China. But Biden will have an opposite force tearing him apart, which is just to say he needs to be not Trump. He needs to stop the trade war. He needs to rejoin the multilateral organizations that Trump left, whether it's the Paris climate deal or the Iran nuclear deal. And he will be trying to do that. And he will be using a much more multilateral approach. And I think that in doing that, he will be trying to establish what is being called a D10, a democracy 10 of alliances, just like G7, for example, alliances of Western and Asian democracies to contain China. So Biden, I think, will be hawkish on China's too, but just through a less protectionist and more multilateralist way. And in some ways, that's more dangerous. In some ways, that's more effective for controlling China, because so many people in the West, so many governments are hawkish on China, but Trump is just, quite belligerent as he's hard to work with. So for Western governments, other Western governments, it will be easier to work with a more predictable American president on through multilateral ways to control China. But yes, I do think China is going to try to use money as the buttering up agent.
Yeah, very true. And I think, obviously there's still so many days to play out for this election. So I don't think we'll really feel the impact of the new or continued, if Trump does come back, foreign policy towards China. And so going back to your earlier points on tech and Made in China 2025, I just want to bring up Huawei again, which I know has been talked about ad nauseum in the UK especially. So do you think this sort of global rejection of Huawei and 5G networks, so we saw, I think it was Italy last week maybe, was the latest to join that. Do you think this is a harbinger of what's to come with Chinese technology around the world? Are we likely to see increased polarization across all forms of technology? Will there be a Chinese group of technologies and a Western? And what's going to be the impact of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think earlier this year I would have said yes, because I was looking at what was happening to Huawei, first of all, which is in a specific sector, telecoms, which is incredibly sensitive, and that totally makes sense. But then the direction, the attention of American and British politicians almost shifted imperceptibly and pretty fast towards Chinese social media companies as well, WeChat and TikTok being the two that have been particularly under the firing line. If that had happened, I mean, Trump, certainly did try to ban the two apps, then it would have been incredible, because it would have been social media companies created by the Chinese that would have had this Huawei treatment in completely non-sensitive sectors. And of course, you can talk about social media data gathering, but we all use Facebook and Twitter and Amazon, so we're all giving our data anyway. What was the missing link was that these companies that worked allied with the Chinese government in a way that Western companies didn't. Now, so I think at that point, I think it was September, when it looked like Trump was really going for the social media companies, I would have said, yes, there was a bifurcation of Chinese tech and Western tech going on. But since then, that ban hasn't been able to go through. The TikTok deal has all sorts of question marks over it, over how much ByteDance actually owns, how much Microsoft actually owns. It's a huge question mark over whether or not it has had a clear conclusion. And when it comes to WeChat, a federal judge stopped it at the last minute. And if Biden does come in, I don't really think he's going to be going after WeChat in the same way. But I will say one thing, which is that China is making this harder for itself by controlling its companies. Its companies are saying, look, we're independent, we're trying to do business abroad. But President Xi, as we saw this week with Ant Financial's failed IPO listing, is hugging these companies ever tighter, and it's making these companies have less credibility when they say that they're independent. For example, during the Huawei row, China would run state media editorials saying that this was xenophobic. Well, no, don't do that. Don't identify the government with these private companies, because the very credibility that they have is that they're independent from you. So if something like what happened this week can happen, then what does that mean for the independence of Chinese companies? So I think it is a really valid question whether or not Chinese tech can be trusted in that same way, and in the decades and years to come as well. If President Xi is really here to stay for a long time, then he will only be hugging these tech companies closer.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what you were saying there. If for those in the audience who'd like to ask a question, please do raise a digital hand. I'm not sure if I'm seeing any at the moment. Michael, jump in if there are people queuing up. But if not, I'd like to go on with another question about, in particular, this sort of the easy ways to provoke China. So as an Australian, and like you mentioned, I'm acutely aware of the interruptions imposed by China on barley, iron ore, and Australian wine as well recently. And we've seen this before with South Korea and with the Philippines, as sort of a boycott of certain of their exports. Do you think we're going to see more of this behaviour in other Western countries? Is it becoming easier and easier to provoke such a reaction, sort of in the way that Ant Group has provoked a reaction that was maybe not predicted?
In terms of China's belligerence in response to Western opposition?
Yes, I guess so. I think the question that I was thinking of was, what would it take for the UK to provoke a reaction like that? Is the threshold becoming lower and lower?
Yeah, I mean, the UK is being very careful. When I mention these British politicians who are very hawkish on China, they're not in government, right? The government itself, I get the feeling that is being dragged along. Boris Johnson, in many ways, is a Cameroon on China. He thinks that trade and cultural exchange is very important. There are figures within his government, especially from the Vote Leave the Brexit campaign, are much more hawkish on China. But that for them, China is not a priority. These other politicians like Tom Tugendhat, they're not in government, they're pulling the government along. So when it comes to that, the government has been very careful about commenting on China. And I think the boldest thing that is done this year is offering amnesty to Hong Kong, 3 million Hong Kong British national overseas passport holders. Now, of course, that's not everyone in Hong Kong, so it's not nearly as good as it sounds. But that did provoke a reaction, but not to the same extent that Australia has provoked. I think the difference is that Australia is really limiting on foreign interference, on foreign investment. And the entire atmosphere in Australia, as you all know, Cameron, is much more like America when it comes to China than the UK. The UK is still, I would say, one step behind in that phase. So I think if the British government started, as indeed the China Research Group has suggested in recent days, putting forward a foreign interference bill, in which case foreign investment in certain sectors will be seen as foreign interference. If it started doing that and limiting China's investment opportunities, whether it's private sector or public sector, then I think China will hit back pretty hard. But I do wonder how much of this hitting back is down to insecurity. One of my other episodes for my podcast is about the wolf warrior diplomats that China has rolled out this year. A lot of it, first of all, is about domestic consumption. It's about looking good to your bosses as a diplomat, so that you're doing something, especially on Twitter. But a lot of it also comes down from this idea that China is bullied on the global stage, but China needs to realize that it is now one of the key players. So it can't have this sort of insecurity, this chip on its shoulder about being, almost in the center of humiliation kind of China is not anymore. So it needs to be behaving like a big state. And so it needs to be less sensitive about this sort of stuff. And I do wonder if by lashing out, it's actually because it's resorting to nationalism as a way of justifying its governance in China, rather than being with the economy doing so well or anything else. Now, I think coronavirus has changed that much more. A really interesting study by the Harvard Ash Center from this year show that China public opinion support for the Chinese government is at the all-time highest since 2003. So that's incredibly interesting. That's come down to how well the state has dealt with coronavirus. I wonder if that narrative will now be pulled back a little bit, because the state feels like it's on slightly stronger ground now with dealing with the coronavirus quite well.
Just on that, on the wolf warrior diplomacy, that actually ties in well with an audience question coming in on how can China address its fraught global image. And I think there's quite a big consensus that wolf warrior diplomacy has done a lot of damage to China's diplomacy. What would you say are the best ways that China could start to address that and reduce its sensitivities to offence?
Well, look, I said that the West doesn't understand China. I don't think China understands the West very well either. If you look at the diplomats who are at the forefront of this, the ones certainly in the West, for example, there was that explosive interview that the ambassador to London, Liu Xiaoming, gave earlier this year when he was questioned by Andrew Marr about the Uyghur camps. And he completely lost that interview, I thought. And I think it comes down to the fact that Chinese politicians and diplomats are not used to Western media questioning them in the same way that Western politicians have to deal with every single day. So you need to understand, ru xiang sui su. You need to, when in Rome, you need to do as the Romans do, right? So you need to, if you're a diplomat in a foreign country, you need to understand how their media network environment works, what the best way is of tackling difficult questions. And you can't just do this top-down, very Chinese way of doing it, which is pulling rank. I'm much more authoritative on this. I'm telling you this is the fact, therefore it is the fact, kind of top-down approach to it. And I think that it's incredible. And I hope that this is part of the difference that these new millennials who are internationally educated will bring to China in future years, which is that just understanding of how Westerners work. And I also think that China is going the wrong direction when it comes to building its soft power, because the more state controlled it is, the less soft power it will have. I was reading an incredible reporting in this week about Zhang Yimou, that the national treasure film director who directed the Beijing Olympics and as well as Hero and other great hits. His film has been, which was tipped to win a foreign film award, was censored by the Chinese government because it was seen as too anti-Chinese. And this is a national treasure director. So you need to let the private sector, you need to let the civil society do its thing in order to build up that soft power. Soft power can't be built from the top down, especially not if your diplomats don't understand how the West works.
I think it's very true, especially at a time when the UK is grappling with its own concept of soft power and sort of working out, what our own international leverage is as well. I think, China has a lot of soft power potential to unleash there, depending on how it addresses its civil society. There's another question coming in on the from the chat. Could you see how the economic realities of this global concession may surprisingly serve to tone down the hawkish trends of US-China?
So I assume it's global recession that was meant to be, but yes, I can definitely see that. For all the bravado that we hear from the UK, which is one other thing that I work so closely on, Westminster politics. We hear so much about this Project Defend, which is reshoring medical supplies back to the UK so that we will never be in a position of needing PPE from China, test swabs, or anything like that. Well, okay, that all sounds great, but how are you going to do that when you're literally in a recession and you're 200 billion pounds spent and counting this year on the pandemic? I don't really know if China's if things that don't make economic sense are going to be taking the front stage, especially with Trump gone. I wonder if that will be taking protectionism down a notch. I think that security will become more important, but yes, the reality of what we're dealing with post-pandemic, the economic downturn that will come, I think will make China a much more desirable outcome. I was reading that HSBC has reported stronger growth this year because it's reliance on Asia and the Greater China region. So Asia is bouncing back from this, and the West needs to understand that. And if that means reshoring supply chains at an extra cost, then it's not something that politicians may necessarily like to do.
And bouncing around a little bit from what you just said then, going to Hong Kong specifically, how do you view the impact of this national security law on tourism and international business?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we have to see how strictly this Hong Kong national security law will be implemented. I know, of course, that journalists are still being arrested on a semi-regular basis, but I've yet to see a foreign business or person being arrested for something that they've said abroad. Obviously, Article 38 of this national security law seems to encompass every single person on earth in it. So we don't know yet how the Chinese government really will use that power, if it will or not. So I don't think that that is a dampener on tourism just yet. I would think that COVID is much more of a dampener on travel at the moment. When it comes to businesses as well, it is a good opportunity for other Asian tigers, other Asian financial centers in Singapore and Tokyo, for example, to really try to take Hong Kong's lead on that. And I just hope that the Chinese government sees that and realizes that Hong Kong is really a jewel when it comes to its financial sector. And the reason it works is because it straddles these two political systems. So if you diminish that, in the medium term, people will be looking for other places to go. Again, though, it very much depends on whether or not this law is just a paper tiger. If it's more for domestic, clamping down on domestic dissent rather than business people internationally.
Yeah, I think very true. And I think obviously COVID has prevented us from seeing the full impacts on Hong Kong, and whether that's COVID related or it's national security law related. So yet to be seen, though obviously people are still getting arrested. So a tense time in Hong Kong and abroad for those watching. Moving back again to global governance, just to jump around, how do you think China can continue to define a more positive role in global governance?
Continue to, I'm not, I'm not sure China has.
A positive role.
Yes. Well, China certainly has tried. And there was that incredible appearance by President Xi at Davos a few years ago, which was just, the global elite loved that, but it wasn't really follow up by economic liberalism. So China is certainly trying to take a front role on these multilateral stage. And for example, you look at the WHO after America left, China is trying to take a front step on that one. But that has been compromised by what's happening domestically because, look at the WHO, its credibility has been incredibly eroded this year by the way that its relationship with China has reportedly played out. I think on climate change is one thing that China could really be thinking about. Obviously, this year as well, President Xi announced the net zero 2060 target. If he really wants to do that, and maybe with a President Biden, that's something that you can transgress all geopolitics because it's something that's facing the entire world, and it's something that China really has, a driving force in because it is the largest polluter. Yet at the same time, it has the largest capability for investing in and building renewable technologies. So it can help on both sides with that. If it can reach 2060 and if it can control its coal consumption, then that will be a good thing, and that will be a positive role that it can play on a multilateral scale. It will be very interesting to see what happens at COP26 next year if Joe Biden is the president, and with China's reaction to that presidency. But I think climate change is the one to watch out for here.
And actually, just continuing on climate change, there's been a question asking whether you think the commitment to carbon neutrality by 2060 is sincere, or whether it's just a play for image. And if I could add also, I think there's an interesting dichotomy with domestic greening and domestic reduction of coal power plants, whilst there's continuing to be an outsourcing or building of coal-powered industry through BRI related developments in neighboring countries. So yeah, what would you say to those two parts of that?
Yeah, so great question. So I was speaking to Isabel Hilton, who is, the veteran environmental journalist for my podcast on this as well. And she was quite optimistic that the Chinese government does understand the importance of climate change because they come from more STEM background, more scientific backgrounds than Western politicians often do. I'm not sure I necessarily do agree with that because as you mentioned, the BRI project, if they make money, coal is totally fine. And coal factories are still increasing in output in China at the moment. So I think China's relationship with the climate is very paradoxical, is very contradictory. So I think that it can be both. It can be a government that realizes that climate change is happening, certainly not deniers, but also it's also a government that wants to make money. When it comes to renewables, if China can be the global leader in that, that comes into Made in China 2025, right? That's environmental technology. That's China taking a global lead in exporting solar panels and wind power. And that will look good as well as be lucrative. So I guess the big question is just whether or not the coal consumption and its oil consumption decreases. And I don't know if China is at that stage of economic development yet. It's as we know, when you're going through an industrial revolution, you need to consume fossil fuels at that large stage, at least because the technology for renewables is not quite there yet. So I think China will still continue to put economics first. But he's made this target now. He's made this 2060 target. So it will be a little bit embarrassing if he doesn't quite meet it. Although having said that, other countries have made much more ambitious targets. The UK has made 2050 a target. I'm not really sure if the UK is going to meet that either.
True, lots of ambition, but we'll see what the reality tells us. And we're going to launch the poll again very shortly, but I just have one more sneaky question before the poll and then our 11 o'clock break. The question is, it seems the CCP is as strong as it's ever been, really, under Xi Jinping right now. How do you see the relative stability of the regime?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what people in the West don't understand quite often is how I don't know what quite the right word is for this, but just at least how the Chinese people are um, satisfied with the government and the political system there. We often get this narrative of either Chinese people being oppressed or being brainwashed or both. But the truth is somewhere in between, right? The Chinese people are much more cosmopolitan, as I mentioned, than before. They're seeing alternative political systems on their travels, but also through social media platforms. And so they are critical thinkers. That is notwithstanding, of course, the fact that the media is incredibly still censored and social media is still censored as well. So I guess that, when it comes to the Chinese government's stability, the people have been underpinning that it's the stability for a long time because economic growth has been so good. If you are getting wealthier, every single Chinese person can remember their parent or their grandparent growing up in vastly different circumstances, not having meat unless it's Chinese New Year, and all sorts of stories of poverty. And that is within such recent memory that the CCP has a head start on economic growth. If economic growth is slowing, I do think that we saw a reverting to nationalism. And as I mentioned, I do think that's partly where the wolf warrior rhetoric comes from. But I think coronavirus has changed the dynamics as well. Coronavirus has made the CCP much stronger. Because it has dealt with the virus relatively well domestically. We saw pictures of that Wuhan pool party where things are largely back to normal. Of course, face masks are ubiquitous, but COVID is not the biggest story on the scene at the moment. And you can talk about, of course, number fudging or anything like that. But I think if the numbers are incredibly out, people would know, just through anecdotally through people going to hospital. So I think that's partly it, but also internationally, the worse that America does and the UK does in dealing with coronavirus, the more China can say, look at us, look at our system of government, look at how much better it's dealt with it because we are draconian, therefore we put your safety at first. Nothing scared the Chinese more in terms of public opinion than when the British toyed with herd immunity. It was seen as such a radically dramatic strategy to be going for, that you're literally putting hundreds of thousands of lives, writing them off so that you can get out of this virus faster. China doesn't believe in that. It believes in a zero COVID strategy. It believes that you can stave off a second wave until the virus is gone. And I don't know if that's true or not. I'm not an epidemiologist, but I think coronavirus has, in those two senses, strengthened the Chinese government.
Yeah, I mean, I think that seems really accurate. It's in a sense been quite a good crisis for China domestically, and easy to compare as well, their response to a lot of Western lack of responses for coronavirus. Unfortunately, we are at time now. So thank you all for those questions coming in. And sorry we didn't get to answer all of them, but please hold on to them because there'll be numerous chances throughout the day to ask them again. But I wanted to thank you, Cindy, so much for your time and your thoughts and for answering so many questions across the full gamut of China relations. So thank you for that. And I think we're going to just relaunch that poll to see if there's been a shift in opinions since you spoke.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Cameron.
Hi everyone, it's me again. Same questions as last time, so just giving you 30 seconds to state your position one more time. It'll be interesting to see whether any attitudes have flipped as a result of listening to Cindy, but just to give you a very quick rundown of the top lines from the last poll, a majority of people, or rather the largest group of people, thought that UK-China relations would be somewhat weaker moving forward into the 2020s up to 2030. But there are optimists among us. 20%, the second largest group, thought that relations could be somewhat stronger. Anyway, we are coming up to 1 minute on the poll, and I think we have all of the votes coming in. Just close the poll and sharing the results one more time. And well, on question number one, very little change. In fact, an increase in the number of people feeling that the next 10 years through to 2030 will not see a strong UK-China relationship. In fact, people expect it to be somewhat weaker. So that is that on the polling for Cindy's keynote.